like we said, that this is part of the SBIR, STTR America Seed Fund. So we get support. We work with the Department of Energy to present these. We're particularly supporting solar and water topics. So if you're applying with the DOE SBIR for those two topics, we'd be happy to help you in these last few weeks, although it is a little close. So hopefully you're not just getting started. Next slide. So just as a reminder, we are part of a power connector team. There's 20 throughout the country, but for this particular venture, we are working with a group of power connectors. Next slide, Shefali. And that would be, there's several groups, CEBN, the Clean Energy Business Network, Arrowhead Center, UACI, EFN, and ADL are all providing support. And throughout the last couple of months, there's been a lot of different events. But as we reach these last couple of months, UACI and Arrowhead Center are both able to provide application review. So again, not writing or redlining, but being able to give you feedback as you have finished up to make sure you've met all the requirements of your SBIR. And so if you have any final review needs or discussion items on submitting your SBIR, please reach out to myself, and then I'll get you connected through either Arrowhead or through our organization. And you can see other events that are being hosted through that link that's on the slides. Next slide. And so then that just brings us today's final topic on commercialization, which will be funding strategies. And I'm so excited to have two of our team members, Shefali Patel, who is a mentor and resident at UACI and has a ton of experience. And if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you've got a chance to see Shefali present and learn a little bit more about her. And then you've also, Sonia hasn't been here for the last couple sessions because she's been on an amazing adventure, but she's back today. And Sonia, her specialty is in SBIR, STTRs, and working in non-dilutive funding. And so she's going to help present as well today. So welcome to Shefali and Sonia, and thank you again for agreeing to be here today, and so excited to see all of you on the call today. So I'm going to turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Anita. And hi, everyone. This is our fourth session. Excited to talk to you all about funding. Today, we're going to scratch the surface, a very deep topic, and I am looking forward to going through the discussion. I'm joined by my colleague Sonia, and the two of us are going to cover an agenda that has, these four learning objectives. We want to give you sort of an overview of what financing options you have at your disposal to grow your venture. The main categories are non-dilutive and dilutive funding. Sonia is an expert in SBIR and STIR types of funding that are available. So she's going to take a deep dive and walk you through the process and the budget and a lot of the intelligence around coming up with your SBIR and STIR strategy. We do want to really focus on understanding the criticality of strategic planning and choosing the appropriate source of capital as you think about your venture, both short-term and long-term, because those choices in the end are very critical in helping you realize the strategy that you intend to get at the end of your journey. So I'll spend some time kind of talking about some of the factors to consider. And then I'll walk you through some of the venture capital basics. It's only a glance. It's, again, a very important industry that funds innovation and will provide you with some of the key concepts and the terminology, and so you can get familiar with what venture capital is about. And with that, the corresponding agenda we have for today is funding options to startups, bootstrapping, grants, loans, angel, VC, crowdfunding. We'll focus on grants. And then venture capital, I'll walk you through some trends, talk about the types of deals and the nature of the contracts and some of the key terms that you need to be familiar with. And before we dive into SBIR, STIR, I wanted to open up with this sort of view of revenue versus time that can help you think very systematically about your product or venture roadmap. And it's important to take a systematic approach when you're thinking about your funding strategy, just as you would when developing your product or when you're developing your market strategy. And the critical elements of this approach includes knowing the types of financing and how they coincide with the stage of venture development. On the right side here, it's a map of revenue versus time. There are other visuals that include, the type of funding series, seed, A, B, C. But for our purposes today, it's revenue over time, early stage, mid-stage, later stage. And you can also think of funding as divided by private when you are in your concept or pre-IPO stage, which is mostly privately financed or government financed, and post-IPO, it's public markets. So making sure that you understand the type of capital that's applicable at the right stage is critical in the decision-making process. Another critical part is identifying the types of players and the personas that are involved. These funding institutions are run by people, they are managed by people, and it's good to know the characteristics and attributes of these players so that you can find the right fit that's most compatible with your DNA as well as your startup type. The life cycle approach, again, helps you consider the major financial milestones as determined by the financial needs. So it's good to have either a financial plan, which I'm assuming most of you have, in terms of the needs of funding needs as matched to the product development, hiring, or market expansion needs so that you can have exact or approximate amount of needs identified by your venture stage and operations. And then most importantly, I want to start out by saying money and power corrupt, and this principle holds very true when you are considering things that have a financial nature to it. And it's important to make sure that you are very clear about principles and ethics at your personal level, at your company, and your organizational level that can help you guide decision-making when it comes to what's non-negotiable and what's allowed in a gray area, because those dynamics do play out as you take on more funding. And it's helpful to have these things clear at the start, as well as refreshed as you take on more funding as your venture grows. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to go through an overview of the SBIR STTR program.
All right. Thank you, Shefali. That was really good. So SBIR is an STTR is typically a way that small businesses and startups use to fund their projects in a non-dilutive way, right? And so I'm not going to go into much detail about the programs because we already had all that series at the very beginning, but I did want to, just for those that are attending today that have not attended those, just to give you a couple of overview slides. So the SBIR in itself started in 1982. About 10 years later, started the STTR, which is for technology transition. and requires that you partner with a research institution, but it has grown tremendously over the last 40 years, basically, to being over 3.5 billion, funding early stage non-dilutive research and development funding for the small businesses. It likes to fund stuff that is going to be high risk, high reward. Otherwise, other large companies would have already taken care of this and found out solutions for these high risk problems. So a lot of small businesses that are involved with those kind of innovative ideas might benefit from competing to get some of these funds. And the original motivation was to help these socially and economically disadvantaged companies to have the opportunity to bid on good funding sources, right, for their innovation. And it's a way to stimulate the economy because, as we all know, the majority of the work gets done by small businesses, contrary to large businesses. So next slide. Okay, so the purpose of the SBIR, like I mentioned, was to fund startups and early stage technology ventures. It's not going to be a loan. You get this money pretty much for free. It's highly competitive, so it's not like I have an idea, I'm going to get the money. You have to compete for it. You have to write a proposal. Proposals are complicated to write. It's going to take you between 100 and 150 hours to write one of these proposals. But here's the key. It's non-dilutive capital, right? And if you can compete for these funds and win, if the government or a federal agency thinks you have a good idea, a good approach, a good team, and they invest on you, it will reduce the risk for future investors. That's one of the big things. Another part is that not only will it de-risk, but you can also potentially give out less equity, right? So it gives you the ability to play that game a little bit stronger tools. And then the other fun part about the SBIR and STTR program is that you become sole source to the government for your innovations, and you would not have to compete for those additional funds. Next slide. Okay, so if typically you look at, and Shefali had another representation of something similar to this chart earlier, if you look at the life cycle of innovation and product development, you start with basic research, you do your proof of concept, you do your research and development, then you do some basic prototyping and manufacturing, you scale up, and you did it, you've got your distribution and sales channels, right? So where does granting and these non-dilutive funding strategies come in? They come in at the front end, right? The intention is to de-risk and to get these ideas commercialized and to the federal government and to the public. So if you look at that, I try to highlight in green where typically, excuse me, you could use the non-dilutive federal funding opportunities to fund your basic research, your proof of concept, some R&D, some prototyping. So it's the front end, de-risk, non-dilutive funding. And then you can kind of see where the friends and family and the angels and the venture capital would fall in that funding strategy. So this is just one representation. If I had to make a change to this, I would say also in green, I would probably put the phase 3 funding, because then, as I mentioned earlier, you would be making sole source, and you can, in parallel with additional funding, continue to scale up and present your offering to the federal government. Next slide. Okay, so this is just an example that I took from the Tech Connect last year, and it breaks it down into the major government offices, again, focusing in the SBIR and STTR program. these are the agencies that currently provide funds. So you've got the largest one, as you notice here, is the Department of Defense, followed by the Department of Health and Human Services, which is including NIH. And then you have the DOE and the National Science Foundation and NASA. Basically, those are the ones that take up the majority of your pie, right? And you're going to find the most opportunities there. The major differences between some of these organizations, some of these are going to be contracts, some of these are going to be grants, where in grants, typically for the most part, you would get to define who's the customer, what's the problem, what's your solution. Whereas in a contract, they're going to have very specific requirements that your proposal will have to address and your innovation would have to solve. And not all of these agencies offer STTR, which is where you need to partner with research institutions, because there's a whole lot less money for STTR funds. And not all the agencies have that much funding to support STTR topics. So next slide. Amanda asked me to also provide an example of a typical schedule of when the different agencies provide funding. And so I just want to give a disclaimer that sometimes the dates change, and sometimes an agency might decide they're not going to do any solicitation. And so these can vary, but it gives you a typical idea of the cycles and the amount of solicitations that come out through the year and when they come out. So for instance, right now, you're going to find some Department of Defense, the NIH is open up to about April. You've got NOAA probably closing if it already didn't close. The DOE, as we're doing now, has an open solicitation, the release 2, that closes, I think, February 23rd. So you will see there DOE is highlighted for January and February on one end, and it will start a little bit early on the year, at the end of the year, I mean. And the pre-releases are about a month before, and then they're open for about another month. Some agencies allow you to talk to their topic authors, some don't. So you need to read each solicitation individually and carefully. Next slide. These are just other types of federal funding that can also become non-diluted. And I wanted to list this for you to be aware of them, because they call them different things based on the agency. So you've got SAM.gov that many of you probably are going through registering, already did. Don't procrastinate, do it as soon as possible. You don't apply at SAM.gov, you cannot submit a proposal to any agency, okay? You can find broad agency announcements through SAM.gov, but sometimes you don't find grants on the SAM.gov. You'll find them under grants.gov, so you have to go and search for things there. NASA calls them NASA research announcements or NRAs, and they have their own site. You could also apply for challenges. And many of you have won the Solar Prize Challenge, for instance. That's also another form of non-dilutive money. You could also do cooperative research agreements, or CRADAs, which typically there's no exchange of funding going back and forth. But if you have a prototype or an idea that you'd like to collaborate with a research institution or with a national laboratory or with a federal agency, they provide the resources and you work together to test your innovation. And that takes your innovation to a higher technology level, reduces the risk. Hence, investors might want to give you money. And you've got procurement contracts, the GSA schedule, and the Fed Connect. And I think that might be it. Next slide.
Yeah.
Back to you, Shefali.
Thank you, Sonia. Wonderful. So next we'll talk about the category of dilutive funding. The main two types here are, as you know, angel capital as well as venture capital. There are other forms which include strategic partnership with corporations, which would take a equity stake in exchange for capital as well as resources, but it's not part of today's scope. So we'll stick to angel and venture, typically considered at a later stage in your startup, past proof of concept. And I wanted to highlight the key differences between the two types, who they are, their approach, check size, and control. So angels are typically high net worth individuals who invest their own money. They're loosely connected as part of a group, but typically invest on their own. Their approach is generally more eager to place a big bet on a startup idea, not a lot of process as compared to a VC. The check size is more modest than what you would see on a venture, typically 100 to 500K, sometimes can go up to $1 million, depends on the angel investor, and the appropriate equity stake in your company, typically anywhere from 20 to 30%. It can be lower, slightly higher, depending on when you take that money and how much capital is involved. Typically, you're looking at shorter exit times versus venture capital, which is there for a long run. Venture typically tends to go from 4 years to 12 plus years in exit. Estimated valuation of the company for angel investment, typically under 50 million. For venture, it's typically over 100. And very, very important key difference is in their management approach. And this actually really is probably the most important factor that plays out day in and day out once you choose between one or the other or both. Angels play an advisory guidance role, as the name suggests, minimal involvement. VCs are very active. They can take operational control if things are not going well. If things are going well, then you retain control, but still have a lot of interaction in intervention from the VCs. So those are some of the key differences. There's a lot more, but wanted to start out with a cursory list. All right. What I wanted to talk about next is some of the origins of the construct of venture capital. There was a great quarterly report in The Economist last November, specifically November 25th of 2021, called Adventure Capitalism. And I really like this graphic because it talks to or conjures the image of venture capital, which is typically high risk, high reward, trying to fuel a startup journey with rocket speed. The type of organization, i.e. a venture capital firm, was first founded or invented by a gentleman named Georges Doriot. He's a French businessman who later taught in the US. And him with a couple other colleagues, including a banker, formed the first venture capital corporation called the American Research and Development Corporation, 6. Prior to that, most of the breakthrough innovation either came from government or private equity from very wealthy families such as Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and so on and so forth. But since the founding of the first VC firm in 1946, this industry has grown steadily and has gone through booms and busts. And we'll see some of the trends in these next slides. And I pulled 4 charts from the same article from November of 21. And these look at the global venture capital activity. I'm sorry. Not sure what happened there. And as you can see, in the last 20 years, the amount of investment from venture capital firms since 2002 onwards has grown from just single-digit billions to over 100. United States, as you can see, has been there from the very beginning and increasingly growing over the last 2 decades, with China also being a big part of the mix in the last decade or so. And very importantly, the role of these VC firms in the global innovation, as you very well know, some of these kind of classic unicorns that they funded, including the Googles of the world, today form 18 trillion of the total public market. So they serve a fantastic purpose and a role in the world of innovation. And more trends as we look at how it's divided by industry. As you can see, software has the lion's share of VC funding globally. And the deal value, if you look at this chart on the right, by seed, early stage, and mature stage of the firm, the early stage deal size has stayed relatively modest over the years, but in the mature stage, the check sizes have gone up to over 50 million for startups. So I just wanted to share that to give you some perspective and data and metrics on how this industry has grown over the last 50 plus years and some of the trends in the last 20. Next, we want to talk about some key considerations and terminology if you are considering dilutive funding, VC, at later part of your venture. And 3 elements that are important are, first and foremost, the investor, founder, or entrepreneur fit. I cannot, as you know and understand, understate this or overstate it. And as you think about approaching your search, doing some internal research on your venture vision, as well as your founder, DNA, as I said, what you value, what you don't, and looking for VC firms that match that DNA is very critical. Specifically, the passion for the technology area of development that you're interested in the niche sector of the market. Personality match in terms of the significance of speed, day to day, week to week, year to year, and the approach to scaling and governance. We talked about operational excellence last week. I realize it sounded like a lot of process, but the importance of having some of that foundation into your startup before you go VC shopping is that it adds credibility and a starting point before you even engage with the VC. So process is important, and we can talk about what that looks like once you engage. As I said, series funding or staged VC funding involves not only systematic research, there's a lot of negotiation once you pass the initial screening from both sides, you as a founder as well as the VC, and it's very privately done. It is good to consider partnering with an expert, either inside or outside, and allocating the time and expertise, otherwise it can distract from your product or market development efforts. And it can be a 6 to 12 month process, and it's exhausting. Number 3 is mechanics of the deal are fairly technical, and it helps to have that expertise, as I said, a finance expert. And you have to remember that the cost of capital comes with equity ownership and dilution. So you need to kind of think very carefully through what you're willing to give up in exchange of that capital. A couple of basic concepts include a term sheet, which we will look at next. It's a non-binding agreement that lays out the terms, and then cap table is a more formal kind of Excel spreadsheet that gives you a way to, look at the distribution of equity by investor and common stockholders. Very importantly, the rights of entrepreneurs are very clearly spelled out, as, for example, anti-dilution. And for VCs, it can get pretty complicated, but a couple of basic ones are the right of first refusal, which essentially says that when you have seed investors which have engaged in a seed round or a Series A round, they deserve rights for later rounds to reject an investor. And they have also pro rata rights in terms of how much they can bid for the following rounds. So it's good to do some research and develop knowledge and understanding of how the mechanics of venture deals work. A very critical concept that are not included here is valuation. It's a topic in and of itself that values the firm pre-money as well as post-money. Next, I want to talk about the profile of an ideal entrepreneur and profile of an ideal VC from each other's perspective. And it's a long list, but I'll highlight a few. VCs look for qualified founders or very strong management teams, so that they know that you have the talent that is committed to the venture and will see it through its end outcome. Clear communication and having a very compelling story is an obvious one. I think the need for speed and process, as I mentioned, is something that becomes a very living element once you engage with a VC. There's requirements for quarterly reports, board meetings, weekly updates, so on and so forth. So, and turning those around in a timely fashion is a given. I think the main one, I'll let you read through the rest, but I want to stress on the relationship between you and the venture capitalist should be based on trust and transparency and a common sense of vision and values, and it'll kind of get you through hurdles and roadblocks and gray areas that come up undoubtedly in a high risk journey. What attributes to look for in an ideal VC? I think first and foremost, you want a founder-friendly VCs. There is a lot of I want to say myths and opinions about what constitutes a venture capital persona, but certain attributes are very, very critical, and they should guide your decision making. Empathy, what's known as patient capital, as your venture experiences roadblocks, unexpected setbacks. You want to make sure you're locked in with the ideal investor. They also bring in a lot of expertise, namely financial, board development, commercial acumen, business acumen, and operations. They can pull in context from their network that can become part of your team or your board. Other institutional investors when you are looking for later rounds of funding. A very key element is VC that's willing to or has the natural balance between knowing when to be a part of your team and lending to do the grunt work, editing your board slides or going through your operational plan, and then knowing when to take a guiding role and sit back and watch you grow. And then passion and intellectual curiosity for the vision for the future and technology and commercial innovation. So those are some of the foundational attributes as you look for your investment partners. Next couple of slides, I want to go through two basic things that you'll come across. Actually, let me start with the term sheet, which precedes a cap table. Term sheet, as I said earlier, is a non-binding agreement. The simplest ones are one page. I think this is a little complicated and busy. I picked it up from Y Combinator, but I've seen from my VC was a very simple one pager that essentially, outlines the amount of money that they're putting at pre and post money valuation, a request for board arrangement, a seat, a director seat, or an advisory seat, how long the term sheet is valid for, as well as voting rights. So wanted to show you an example. I've seen a term sheet that had a duration of 3 to 4 weeks. In my experience, we signed it within 3 weeks, and it was a very, very quick process that involved a lot of negotiation, but it can have a duration of multiple months. So it varies by investor. Capitalization table is a way to manage and look at the equity distribution. There is a software tool called Carta, which allows you to manage it real time. This is required by most VCs, and it's a key part of a deal-making process. And it's typically organized by the shareholder type. The common shareholders are the company employees, including the management team, as well as the investors in Series A, Series B, or Series C, and the type of stock that's given out. The company team usually gets common stock. The investors get preferred stock. It also outlines the equity ownership, pre and post money valuation, and the share price. And then in conclusion, what I wanted to outline is, again, kind of funding strategy is all about, being grounded and aligned in your overall startup vision, short-term, mid-term, long-term. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you should have an idea of where you're going. So to inform your investment and financial decisions and who you partner with. And clearly, a startup strategy also has your product and market development milestones, which help you with the timing and the actual amount and needs of financing. Rooted in founder DNA, as I pointed out, being very, very clear about your ethics and principles and how you're going to stand up to those 100% of the time, not 99%, not 95%, but 100% of the time. And then, be cognizant that your funding strategy is a mix of very deliberate analytical process that you'll engage in at the start. But as you move forward, you have to be listening to some of the emergent signals and how it actually shakes out as you're engaging with investors and venture partners, supported by sound metrics and data. And with that, I wanted to offer you some reading and references. I picked up these 2 books and think they are well written. The Power Law, Venture Capital, and the Making of the New Feature was rated the top book by The Economist last year by Sebastian Mallaby. He is, I think it's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, also a member of The Economist, and has written a book about the rise of this important industry. And then Peter Thiel from his days of founding PayPal. And then I've listed a couple of sources. There's not a lot of literature out there, but a couple of SBIR papers. PitchBook is a good database to look at trends and data. And then websites, major VCs. You can go to any of the big ones, Sequoia, Khosla, so on and so forth. I personally like A16Z because it has a lot of actionable insights and podcasts. And with that, I am going to turn it over for questions.